Josh Frydenberg waiting for us in Canberra. So we'll switch back to Canberra now and catch up with the Treasurer. Thanks for joining us. First up, you might have caught a bit of that from Dean Deacon in Western Australia. You must be so frustrated at the hard borders in Queensland, in South Australia, in Western Australia, and what they're doing, not just to the economy, but to community life, people's normal socialisation around the country.
Well, it's true that Western Australia has avoided the economic impact of COVID that we've seen in New South Wales and Victoria with their extended lockdowns, but there are definitely businesses across Western Australia that are doing it tough, particularly in the tourism sector as a result of the closed borders. In fact, Chris, we recently announced a grant program for small businesses in the tourism sector in partnership with the Western Australian Government to help mitigate some of those impacts that they're feeling. Now, it's obvious that we're going to have to live with COVID. Zero COVID forever is unrealistic. They're not my words, they're the words of the Doherty Institute. So we've got to be upfront with the Australian people, and that is whether they're in Western Australia or in New South Wales or Victoria, and explain what that actually means. It means there will be illness, it means there will be death, it means there will be more cases, but with 70 and 80% vaccination rates, we can ease restrictions and ultimately see an opening up of the country where we can travel again more freely across borders. Yeah, it's been good to see you and Scott Morrison talking about that reality more this week. It's something this program's focused on for months because it's an inevitable reality that we all have to live with COVID. Of course, the big problem with the Federation is how much power you have to get the states to do the right thing. So a couple of weeks ago on this program, I suggested this. We might soon have two Australias, New South Wales living with COVID and the rest with hard borders, locked in paranoia. Scott Morrison needs to make sure this does not happen. To start with, he might want to declare that once any state hits 70% vaccination, they never get another cent for lockdowns. Yeah, that was the idea, use the purse strings. And this is exactly what you've been threatening to do now, to not fund any more lockdowns beyond what point, 70% or 80%? Well, I've been very clear that there should be no expectation, Chris, on behalf of the Premiers and the Chief Ministers, that the scale of our emergency economic support would continue in the same way when we reach those targets of 70 and 80%. I mean, the work of the Doherty Institute is world-leading, and it's been agreed by the Premiers, the Chief Ministers and the Prime Minister at National Cabinet. Now, if you're a small business watching your a small business owner, or indeed their staff who's watching your program tonight, you know, in New South Wales and Victoria, your doors are closed and you've got a very uncertain future. You need hope. You need to know that there is a plan to open up the economy in a COVID-safe way. That is what has been agreed at National Cabinet. That's why Australians are rolling up their sleeves, getting the jabs in record numbers. They're holding up their part of the bargain. Now it's up to the Premiers and the Chief Ministers to hold up theirs. Does the same go for borders? Do you make the same threat about funding decisions if they maintain hard borders rather than lockdowns? Well, again, we have been providing economic support to states where there have been closed borders, like Western Australia. Now, there have been one-off payments, they've been for the tourism industry, but ultimately when you get to the 70 and 80% numbers of vaccination, then we would hope that we would start to see our borders open and that people could move more freely. Now, if a state premier seeks to defy that ambition, then they're going to have to be accountable to their own electorate to explain why families can't be reunited at Christmas. They're going to have to explain why businesses in the tourism sector will continue to be hit. And what we really need to do is move and shift our mindset from one where we're fearing the virus to one where we're living with the virus and mitigating its impacts. The rest of the country are living with, the rest of the world are living with COVID, and now Australia can with higher vaccination rates. And as the Doherty Institute have pointed out, Chris, we live with influenza. And we have 200,000 cases of influenza every year and 600 tragic deaths. But we live with it, and we have to adopt the same mindset with COVID. Should kids be back at school now?
I absolutely want to see kids back at school, and we need to be more creative, and ultimately it's going to be the state premiers and the chief ministers, because they're in charge of the day-to-day running of the school system, to be more creative in finding a way to get the kids back into the classroom. What really upsets me and what worries me is that our kids are falling behind in their educational standards because they have been out of the classroom. A virtual classroom is no substitute for a physical classroom. Interaction with the teachers, being with your schoolmates. Chris, we both have young kids and we know how difficult it is to be homeschooling. We know what it means to be effectively isolated from your friends. And in Victoria, we've had more than 200 days of lockdown, and that is a pretty high price to pay, particularly for our young kids.
Yeah, it's terrible for kids, and the risk to them is so tiny. It's the place for them is at school. Now, just before I let you go, neither your team nor mine is going to be in the grand final this year. Carlton and Adelaide might get in next year's grand final. But is Western Australia... Yeah, but the AFL's announced that if they can't have the grand final at the MCG, it'll be going to Western Australia. Now, Mark McGowan will say that's his state's reward for the hard borders and being zero COVID. It's hard not to see it that way, isn't it?
Well, it'll obviously be very disappointing to lose the AFL Grand Final for a second year. As you know, this is one of the many amazing sporting events that Melbourne usually plays host to. It's a fixture on the sporting calendar, and it's the pinnacle of our great national game. AFL, and so it will be heartbreaking for many Victorians to lose the grand final, particularly if their team is in it. And who knows, it may be Melbourne, Geelong, the Bulldogs who make a grand final. So let's just wait and see what happens. But obviously, I would love to see the grand final stay in Melbourne.
You Victorians, you're always pushing the local teams. Thanks for joining us, Josh. I appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Might be better to have the Giants versus the Swans. Hey, it can't be that because they're going to have an elimination final this weekend. One of the Sydney teams over there in the West against Port Adelaide. That might be a better outcome.